I want to talk about this feud between Rubio and Zelensky. I wouldn't call it a feud between Rubio and Zelensky, though. I would call it more accurately Marco Rubio embarrassing himself in front of the country because Marco Rubio has to speak for the position of the State Department because he is, head of the State Department, and he's also a national security advisor. So Rubio recently was making statements about how the Ukrainians have gotten so much help from the United States and the Europeans have given so much little help in comparison to the United States, and that, it's, oh my gosh, we're trying to get peace. That is our ultimate objective. But ultimately, these European states are not contributing as much as us. They're saying we helped much more. You're not contributing towards peace. Let me see if I can find the clip to play it. Here it is.
Mr. Secretary, are you going to ask G7 to help with the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, it's in their interest to help. The other countries get far more of their fuel from there than we do.
But what kind of help are you going to ask? Is it minesweepers, naval help?
Well, those specifics, I'll leave it to the Department of War as to exactly what, but it's in their interest. It's in their national interest.
Do you think President Trump criticizing NATO this morning, that sentiment?
I think he just made an observation, and the observation is that the United States is constantly being asked to help in a war, and we have more than any other country in the world on a war that's happening in another continent, in Ukraine. But when the U.S. had a need, he didn't get proper positive responses. So right now he's just making the observation that, I think there was a couple of the leaders in Europe who said that this was not Europe's war. Well, Ukraine is not America's war, and yet we've contributed more to that fight than any other country in the world. So it'll be something to examine. The president will have to take into account down.
See, the framing here is different because what it used to be is that America contributed more than Europe. That's what they used to say. But now America hasn't contributed really any aid at all to Ukraine since Trump has entered the White House. And so over that time, Europe has clearly overtaken the United States. I mean, even during the end of Biden's presidency, it seemed to be taking that trend to begin with. But they've simply just changed the gear from, the United States has provided more than Europe to, the United States has provided more than any individual state. Well, yeah, France alone is not going to be able to match what the United States gave because they don't have the budget. They don't have the capacity. As a united unit, when you go like person to person, the European taxpayer pays a lot more into Ukraine than the American taxpayer has. And the American taxpayer hasn't paid at all into Ukraine, really, since Trump has gotten into the White House. But this framing of Europe the leecher, Ukraine even sometimes the leecher, but he's not leaning into that right here. It continues. Now, at the same time that he said this, Zelensky came out with a statement, and he said that he was told that in order to end the war and get American security guarantees, not assurances like before, if it's an assurance, we can just forget about it and betray people. But if it's a guarantee, now it's ironclad and it's different. And this word change means significance, and Trump administration is to be trusted. But anyway, security guarantees can be given if Ukraine withdraws from the Donbass. If they give up the cities of Konstantinivka, if they give up Druskivka, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and all these other villages between Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, and the 15 kilometers between them and Russian position, 17 kilometers actually, 17. This is not something that's an option to the Ukrainians. They can't tell over 100,000 people to get out of their homes and flee. That it's sorry, but we have been told by the Russians and the Americans that your sacrifice is necessary for the rest of our security. This is what the Russians require, especially since that area is also known as the Fortress Belt, an elevated place of territory, an elevated geography on top of a bunch of fortresses and defensive positions that have been built in case it got to the point of the final battle of the Donbass. It's not like the Ukrainians haven't fought and won the battle for Kramatorsk before, back during the 2014, 2015 Donbass war period. So this was something that the Ukrainians said was not an option, that they were told that if they wanted those security guarantees, they wanted that support, that they had to bring an end to the war, and, that means give up the Donbass. Now, Marco Rubio comes out and says that's a lie. Specifically, that's a lie. Not, oh, that's not exactly true. That's a lie that the Ukrainians told. That's just totally not true.
Did the U.S. tell Zelensky that security guarantees depend on withdrawal from Donbass?
That's a lie. And I saw him say that, and it's unfortunate he would say that because he knows that's not true, and that's not what he was told. What he was told is the obvious. Security guarantees are not going to kick in until there's an end to a war, because otherwise you're getting yourself involved in the war. Okay, what is a security guarantee? It is troops that are willing to step in and secure. If you put that in place now, that means you're injecting yourself in the war. What he was told very clearly, and he should have understood it, is that the security guarantees come only after there is an end to the war. But that was not attached to unless he gives up territory. I don't know why he says these things. They're just not true.
Now that's interesting, because there has been reporting about, in private meetings, the suggestion of giving up the Donbass being put on Zelensky, each time him rejecting it before. So this reporting of an offer like this, it isn't coming out of nowhere. This isn't reporting that particularly surprises me. When I see the interlocutors that the Trump administration puts forward on the issue, people like Steve Witkoff that can't even name the regions that he wants to give up, then it wouldn't surprise me for this type of offer to be put forward. I don't think Jared Kushner is particularly dedicated to the Ukrainian people, and those who might have had some 2 cents on the matter, like Keith Kellogg, were slowly boxed out before he recently resigned, even though he was supposed to be the point man because he could actually speak Russian. But they instead went with Steve Witkoff, who had to rely on a a Kremlin-provided translator in order to negotiate with them. Well, during that process, after over 400 days of negotiating, that has failed. It has failed miserably. It has gone nowhere. We are no closer to peace. 24 hours was not only a pipe dream, it was a mockery of the human clock, the human-created concept of time. So this has been a failure in negotiating. And I think that the Trump administration wants a quick out, that they see the midterms around the corner. They see this war dragging on now with Iran as well. And they see that their promises have not been fulfilled. They see how they're doing in the polls, and they want a quick out. They wanted a quick out at the start, but weren't willing to invest the means, as he promised on the campaign trail, to give the Ukrainians what was necessary if the Russians didn't come to the table and they didn't negotiate in good faith. He has instead allowed the Russians to drag him around like a dog and make him think that he's being negotiated with in good faith, even now having Representative Paula Ann Luna bring in Russian representatives over from the State Duma, including representatives of political parties that have had their leaders say things like, I'd rather have a missile land in Washington than visit. There's a bunch of people here under sanction for various reasons, many of them involving the illegal invasion of Ukraine. They got brought around. They got a tour of the facilities. This is supposed to be like a really good honor, by the way. Really like high honor. We bring them to Alaska, roll out the red carpet, have Marines roll out the red carpet for Putin to just lecture the president on a bunch of historical shit that didn't matter at all. Then after that, we roll out the red carpet for these people to walk in Washington, D.C., giving sanctions exemptions, temporary sanctions exemptions for these individuals, for them to walk around D.C., and then afterwards be gifted Trump knickknacks. Trump knickknacks. U.S. Congressman gives State Duma deputies socks with a picture of Trump. Among the gifts was also a personal badge from Anna Paula Luna. Huh. Fascinating. Here is one of the State Duma delegation members also saying that they had meetings with both members of both parties, Republicans and Democrats. Now, it's hard for me to picture exactly. No, it's not hard for me at all to picture a Republican having meetings with these people. That is very easy for me to believe. There's people who sympathize with the Russian invasion in the Republican Party because they've allowed that type of authoritarianism and war crimes apologia infest its portions of its base through conspiracy knuckle draggers that are taken seriously as alternative media commentators. But in the Democratic Party, it's very hard for me to imagine who this could be. I mean, what sitting Democrat is having meetings with Russian representatives in relation to hearing their perspective? That's what this guy says. They're here to hear our perspective in relation to our national interests and to advocate. He says this directly the Telegram, and to advocate for Russia's national interest. So they're coming over to Washington, D.C. to meet with American political officials to advocate within the halls of Congress, giving sanctions exemptions in order to do so, to advocate for, and I quote, according to them, Russia's national security interests. What do these people view as Russia's national security interests? The destruction of Ukraine. The destruction of the state that we committed to protecting after they gave up its atomic weapons to Russia at our ask when we held food aid over them. Some people are saying, I bet it was Fetterman. No, Fetterman doesn't like the Russians, right? One issue he isn't completely like brain dead on. But that's basically every elected Democrat. That's why it's hard for me to imagine any Democrat in the Senate or any Democrat in the House meeting with these people. I think about the progressive delegation, but I can't even think of anybody from Rashida Tlaib to the most progressives in the House that would accept a meeting with these people. So I think that them talking about meeting with people from both parties is kind of hard for me to believe. I can believe that he met with people part of the Republican Party, but unless I am shown some evidence or I figure out which Democrats they possibly could have met with, this could, of course, just be them speaking, trying to create more verbal influence, make it sound like they have more influence than they do. Part of the problem with the Donald Trump Nixonian view of Trump's going to break up Russia and China's relationship and Russia's going to lean more towards the United States, just you wait, just you see it, is these people don't believe the Democrats are ever going to change their tune on Russia. Not after the last 12 years. It's just not possible. And so that's part of the reason why it's hard for me to believe this part of it. Hard for me to believe this part of it. So I think in this environment, I would say, here's my idea of what happened, right? My idea for what happened, since there are those in the administration that see this war as a barrier to get around in trying to build a productive relationship with the Russians. Others, like Marco Rubio, probably don't feel that way, but a lot in the administration do. So this is how I think the conversation went in relation to Ukraine and giving up territory in the Donbass. Here is my idea. What I imagine is that they had a meeting, and this is alongside other reporting, previous reporting that has said something along the lines of this, not in the details that I'm saying. This is my speculation, but we already have reporting saying that the idea of Ukraine giving up the Donbass in order to get some sort of ceasefire, a ceasefire that could lead to a long-term peace deal, that would be necessary from the Russians. And so maybe the Ukrainians should do that. And that each time that this was put forward to the Ukrainians, they had a back and forth, and the Ukrainians would basically say no, that was not an option. It was not politically feasible. It was not strategically feasible when it came to giving up the fortress belt. And after everything that happened, they don't feel it was principally feasible as well. That with the Russians able to just start the war again, maybe in a year or so, they don't know. The Russians possibly could, and they have to be ready for that. And they don't want to give up their defensive lines in order to, make it easier for them. And so the idea supposedly died there. That's the last time we heard about it, is that the Ukrainians dug their heels in. The United States wasn't supporting them more beforehand. They weren't supporting them more after. And so it was essentially a shuffle Trump did trying to get something through, and it just did not work. So that's the last time I heard about it. If this was brought up again in a meeting, this is what I imagine was said. The Ukrainians are talking to the United States, and the United States says, we will give you security guarantees at the cessation of this war. We have said that before, and we are now saying it again. It was not the first time the United States has said that. But the war is not over. So we can't give you security guarantees right now. And right now we're talking about diverting more PAC-2 and PAC-3 interceptors to the Middle East instead of Ukraine due to our heavy air campaign against the Iranians. Ukrainians probably took some, umbrage with that, don't like it. Like, so if you don't like that, you need to find a way to bring an end to the war. The Russians have said that if you withdrew from the Donbass, they'd be willing to put an end to the war. So that's not the United States saying withdraw from the Donbass. That is the United States saying, we'll give you security guarantees while we also can't give you the same amount of air interceptors that we used to give you. We will give you security guarantees if you withdraw, if there's an end to the war. And the Russians also have just said that if you withdraw from the Donbass, there'll be an end to the war. So it's not that I think there was a way where they didn't directly say it, but they did basically imply it. And considering what reporting has said about previous conversations, this is very easy for me to believe. Very easy for me to believe that they said something along the lines of, the end of the war will mark our security guarantee. By the way, the Russians said if you withdraw from the Donbass, they will end the war. So that's what I think probably happened. Obviously, the Ukrainians cannot give up the Donbass, so the war continues. And also, even if they did, the war may continue just 6 months later. Also, if you wanted to hear some inspirational speech from Donald Trump, I'm sorry, there's just he spoke so much knowledge today. I want to make sure we don't ignore it.
Seeing right now, what is missing in leadership?
Well, it's winning. You got to win. You know, I've watched a lot of people, leaders, great leaders. And, you know, the one thing about sports is you break it down into, you know, a 2-hour period, something nice. You don't have to wait a lifetime to find out is somebody a winner or a loser. You got a lot of losers, mostly losers, fortunately. It's a good thing to have a lot of losers. I always like to hang around with losers, actually, because it makes me feel better. I hate guys that are very, very successful and you have to listen to their success stories. I like people that like to listen to my success.
That explains the majority of his cabinet, doesn't it? That explains quite a bit.
Last week, 28,000 soldiers died. The week before that, 32,000 soldiers died. I think we're going to get it settled, but it's a terrible thing. Worse since World War II. I settled 8 wars, and this should have been one of the easier ones, but the hatred between President Putin and President Zelensky is extreme. Never good. Hatred's a bad thing when you're trying to settle a war.
So fucking stupid. I mean, I'm sorry, he's learned nothing. It's like he hasn't learned anything about peacemaking, hasn't learned anything about bringing an end to war. The reason the war isn't over isn't because Zelensky and Putin don't like each other personally, okay? He views geopolitics too interpersonally. Some people don't view it interpersonally enough, and they're going to be stale, and they're not going to be able to understand, you know, the personalities of different leaders. He only focuses on that, and he's unable to understand like exactly why the Donbass matters. He's trolling. No, this is him. This is him. He's not trolling. This is just who the president of the United States is. Settled 8 wars. The Congo, where villages. By the way, if somebody says a war is over, and you can still see the smoke of villages burning from massacres as men, women, and children are slaughtered by militias, I just want to put out, if you can see that from satellites, that is not a cessation of a war, okay? There's been a lot of calling of this is not a war, military operation. That is not a special massacre operation. That is still a war. Degenerate Liberty, thank you so much for the gifted 2 tier 1 subs. To Prime Evil and Pizza Steph, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you. Degenerate Liberty, one of my favorite Twitter stalkers, liking all my tweets. I appreciate it.